Hello, everybody, and a big welcome. My name is Jane Tewson, and I'm part of the team at Igniting Change. And our name, Igniting Change, says it all. We're passionate about igniting change by combining extraordinary lives to spark big, positive changes in our community. And we value the voices of people who have lived experience and whose diverse backgrounds enrich our perspectives. And we're very proud to be doing that here tonight in partnership with the Wheeler Centre. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which tonight's event is taking place. Sovereign land that was never ceded. And the fire in my belly burns ever more fiercely at the scale of the challenges that we face as a nation to bring our First Nations people equity, justice, and fairness. And I acknowledge their resilience, strength, and pride as they reckon with the sorrow and pain of the impacts of colonisation. And I pay my deepest respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their elders, past and present. And I warmly welcome any First Nations people with us this evening, along with all of you that have joined us. I'd like to share my boundless respect and admiration for Meredith Whittaker, who I can't see because of the lighting. There she is. I had the exceptional fortune to spend time with Meredith earlier this year, and it's thrilling to see her again here in Australia. Meredith, you're so accomplished, you're insightful, you're knowledgeable, you're astonishingly brave, and you're a heap of fun. And not many people stand up to big business, but even fewer people stand up to tech giants. And I'd say we need more of you, Meredith, and more of your courage. And thank you for travelling so far to be with us in Australia. We've got so much to learn from you. Thank you. And I'm also pleased to introduce our interviewer this evening, Vanessa Taholka. Vanessa spent her career working on digital solutions across a multitude of different sectors. She is, as such, a highly regarded technology commentator, as well as community radio broadcaster, and we're delighted that she could be with us to host the inevitably rich conversations that are going to follow. And on behalf of the Wheeler Centre and Igniting Change, please join me in welcoming Meredith and Vanessa.
Thank you, Jane. That was lovely, and it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for hosting us and inviting us. And I just love the tradition of the land acknowledgement as an everyday practice, which as an American we need more of. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining me, Meredith, and thanks for joining all of us here in freezing Melbourne in winter. I know that there's tremendous interest in what Meredith has to say tonight, so I'll flag now that there will be a moment for questions later in the session. So do get your thinking caps on and make it worthy of this very esteemed audience. I thought I would start, and shake me off if you will, with going back to the original sins. In some of your writing, you have proposed that there were two original sins committed in the race to commercialise the internet. One being no restrictions on commercial surveillance, and one endorsing advertising as the business model of the commercial internet. Can you expand a little on that for some of our audience who maybe haven't read fanatically everything that I've read?
Oh, yeah. I love this question. Thank you. And yeah, I want to acknowledge that I draw on the work of the scholar Matthew Crane a lot in looking back at the 90s as this period of laying, the sins of the 90s that we must now atone for, which is how my thinking has developed. And, yes, I think those two moves, they weren't the only sins, but they laid the cornerstones for the toxic business model that we're grappling with across so many symptoms when it comes to these large tech platforms, these large tech monopolies. And I'll go into a very abbreviated history because this could, honestly, this could be a 700-page monograph if we wanted it to be. But you had the Clinton administration it's the neoliberal era, right? The neoliberal orthodoxy is reigning. They're coming off the backs of manufacturing decline and looking for an economic miracle. So the idea that you could commercialize networked computation, that you could take the investments that had been made by the military and some academic institutions in laying down, the internet as we call it now, but which at that time existed more as research networks or government infrastructure, was sort of the solution they lit upon. And there were many in the coalition who actually called the idea of the commercial internet the New Deal without the socialism. So they were really looking for a kind of market-driven miracle to elevate the US economy, and this took on a huge amount of momentum throughout the 90s. Now, it really matters that the rules of the road, when they were laid down in the framework in 1996, were to put no restrictions on privacy. And as Matt Crane's work documents, it wasn't that they didn't know this was a problem. They had internal reports from their own government agencies saying like, whoa, there are huge civil rights, huge constitutional concerns, huge, simply concerns with the management of personal data if you don't regulate around privacy, if you don't take this seriously. They dismiss them. And they had a huge amount of pressure, of course, from the advertising industry, which for a very long time had effectively owned television and print media and didn't want to see another media and communications infrastructure grow up without them being able to participate. So those two decisions taken in concert effectively created this, let's say, the flywheel of momentum for the surveillance business model. Because of course, private entities now have license, if they're jurisdictioned in the US, to surveil as much as they want, well beyond what is permissible for governments. And because they're looking at this advertising-supported model, know your customer becomes the imperative. So know more and more and more about people so you can sell advertisers access to types of people who are likely to buy your ad, click on your whatever, some weird pink toothbrush on Instagram or some shady supplement or whatever it is. But that was, this is the engine of the tech economy that was set down then that continues to persist as, in my view, the heart of the pathologies we're dealing with now. Because on the back of these rules, the platform surveillance companies were able to establish themselves throughout the 2000s, collect more and more and more data, benefit from network effects. So, billions of users, shaping the paradigm for different computational infrastructures. And then, of course, at the end of the 2000s, we started seeing the catalysts for the AI boom. And there was a particular paper in 2012 I won't go into, but effectively what happened is there was a recognition that old algorithmic techniques dating from the late 1980s could do new and interesting things in terms of optima seeking when matched with huge amounts of data and massively powerful computational systems. And that was sort of the light bulb moment for this industry to realize, like, hey, guess what we have and no one else really has? Huge amounts of surveillance data and the infrastructures already in place, already calibrated to collect and process that data. So when I say that AI is a surveillance derivative, I'm talking about that infrastructure and that economy, as it were. And again, that dates back to these original sins. So I also look at what would it take to atone for those sins, to put it in that theological language, and how might we look at those fundamental roots of the problem instead of tinkering on the edges of models or trying to sort of reduce bias or bolt an auditing system onto an infrastructure that I believe is fundamentally toxic for many of the things we all care about.
You talked a little about network effects there and some of the advantages that people who got in at a certain time in their various sectors in the tech business the advantages that they've had. We're seeing another wave of that with the building of artificial intelligence sort of tools and the data grab that's going on now. Have you had any thoughts about how antitrust measures might have and may still continue to mitigate some of the concentrations of power and abuse of power in that industry?
Yeah, I mean, I was at the FTC for a little under a year, so I was certainly thinking about that then. And I think antitrust is one set of interventions. I think for me, one of the most hopeful approaches in antitrust would be something called structural separation. And to put that colloquially, that would effectively be separating the infrastructure layer from the application layer. We could divide it in different ways. But I don't think antitrust is the only remedy. And I also think we have a lot of tools on the table that aren't being used. So we can look at GDPR. A very conservative reading of GDPR would enable banning surveillance advertising. It's fairly clear. But what we don't have is political will to do that, and that gets into some of the realpolitik and some of the issues that we face when we have companies on whom governments and global information ecosystems are dependent, who leverage, often have more power than governments in some of these areas. And so, how do you actually take them on? What leverage do we have to do that? Yes, we can pass regulation like GDPR, but why isn't it being enforced? Or what happens when this regulation is enforced, like the European Commission, bringing a lawsuit against Apple for some of their
sales practices,
yeah. And kind of lock-in practices, and then Apple immediately, acting to remove certain services from the European market. So it's tricky.
That's very fresh news. I want to talk about Signal before we move too far down any of these other lines. You came on board of Signal in the newly created role of president in 2022, which has been just in time, I think, to start defending Signal and encryption in general, I would say, against lots of attacks from various nation states and companies around the world. How does Signal's approach to privacy and encryption differ from the data collection practices of the sorts of major tech platforms we've been discussing?
This is a great question because it's like opens it up for me to say entirely. It completely differs. It is as the opposite as it can be while still operating within an ecosystem and normative structure that is shaped by those companies. So we're swimming upstream, but nonetheless, we have to use libraries created by engineers at these companies. We have to interop. We have to, if we're not on the App Store, no one uses Signal, so we better be on the App Store, and that means we need to meet their mystical review processes and all of that. So Signal, one, I think it's important. This is important not as a flex, but also as a structural safeguard in the industry we're in, that we are a nonprofit. And being a nonprofit means, one, our objective function, to use a statistical term, or the goal is not revenue and growth. The goal is a mission that is sort of, in our incorporating documents. And that, to be very blunt about it, means I don't have a guy on my board who's constantly agitated because this privacy thing just isn't working out. You're not making the money. Can you, whittle it down a little bit? Maybe Signal for Business, and that's a little surveillance. Can we do that? So we don't have those pressures. I also don't have a temptation to sell out. And even if I did have that temptation, I wouldn't be able to do it with Signal because under the tax code, we have to reinvest any money in a, commensurate kind of mission-driven cause. So those things are really important, not just generally, but in an industry where profit is accrued either by surveillance, so collecting, creating data about people, selling, the derivatives of that data to advertisers, or using that data to train AI models. Like, that's the engine. You either do that or you provide sort of infrastructure and services to those who do. And so, if we were a for-profit in that industry, it's very likely that we would either sink, or we would continue to carve out ways of compromising our mission. And so we don't do that. I I think it's also, others are joining in the nonprofit tech kind of, the Proton, the encrypted email client just switched from a for-profit to a nonprofit, kind of recognizing these structural issues and the integrity that, this brings. And then that allows us to be incredibly focused on our mission, which is collecting as close to no data as possible while running a large-scale global communications app and providing as close as we can the features and the services and the functionality that people simply expect when they pick up a messenger. Because it does not matter how ideologically committed to privacy you are, Berlin cryptographer. Like, your dad probably doesn't care, right? You fall in love, your boyfriend probably doesn't care, right? Like, you still need to talk with other human beings, and unless you live in a sad monoculture, the infrastructures are gonna have to meet their needs, even if you're happy sort of degrading your experience. So to us, that's really important. I could go on and on about Signal, but I'll answer another question.
Well, that's great, though.
Yeah.
You've spoken about, you have to play with the same technology that everyone else is playing with and, by those rules to the extent that you do. But as a non-profit, you have blogged, not you personally, but Signal have blogged, that privacy is priceless, but Signal is expensive. And broken down transparently, the sort of costs that go into providing a robust, environment that meets the privacy standards that we think it should, in a market where your competitors are funded by billion-dollar companies. How does Signal think about organisational transparency and the importance of that? And, why do you publish those sorts of things?
Well, in that case, that was me and my great colleague, Josh Lund, who spent a long time on that blog post. One, because I think there needs to be way more transparency about the political economy of tech, and I'm in a position to do that. It's not corporate confidential information that's gonna give up something to competitors that would get me fired, right? That's something we can't talk about. I think in doing that, and it's the TLDR of that post is we project around next year, it will cost about $50 million a year to develop and maintain Signal, 50. Which is, it's a tiny sum when you're in a tech business. That's a very small budget. And I get a lot of congratulations from tech execs who are like, keeping it lean, Mayor. But that's a lot of money in the real world. So, one thing I hope that does is just expose how incredibly profitable the surveillance business model is. That all of these things we use for free, et cetera, like actually make that data collection, that ad sales, the AI training, all of that is making a handful of firms an unfathomable amount of money, because again, that is lean. And what we're talking about in terms of these, massive platform infrastructures cost way, way more than that. Like, that is a rounding error in a small budget at Google. So I also hope that helps us be a bit bolder when we envision alternatives. Like, there's a reason almost every single tech for good proposal is a scrap on the roadside, because we don't talk real capital. We don't talk real resources. And it's almost like we are self-satisfied with a proof of concept without really putting our shoulder behind the wheel and saying, no, we actually have to build an alternative, right? It doesn't have to be an alternative that looks like what they're building. Although there's an issue with norms and expectations and the fact that if you're using their APIs, it kind of has to accord with some interop standard. But that's a more in the weeds conversation. But we can build computational tech, as Signal shows, that works differently, that does different things, that is more respectful, more dignified. But it takes marshaling real resources and effort. It's not a question of ideas. It's a question of power and resources. And so, and sometimes I'm like, okay, can we stop with the ideation sessions? I've been to these for 20 years. I've been in retreats in Maine talking about what we would do. Everything's in the subjunctive, right? And I'm like, we know. Okay, can we, now let's get serious. Anyway, that's a divergence.
I want you in my next workshop. Anyhow, you have called out AI as a marketing term, not a term of art. And you've talked about how you see companies wielding this concept of AI as the apex of human progress, or the next step in technological advancement for, it's like a new enlightenment. There is a lot of superlatives going around there. Can you speak to, what's problematic about this narrative to you, and how the surveillance business model has shaped the development of AI just as much as it has the last wave of, internet technologies?
Yeah. Well, calling it a marketing term is just factual, right? Anyone in the machine learning field, or, who's done data science that got rebranded AI by their, marketing department, knows that, right? And even machine learning is a broad umbrella under which many divergent subfields exist. So AI is a marketing term, literally. It is right now being used to describe, data intensive, compute intensive statistical models that, do interesting things with probability. And, an interesting thing is, suck up the corpus of text-based data on the web, and then use that to be able to probabilistically answer a query or a question with text that is plausibly shaped. That's really interesting and impressive in some ways, but nonetheless, that's one variant of AI that looks nothing like the expert systems of the 1970s, right? Which were also called AI. That looks nothing like what John McCarthy was working on when he coined the term as a way to get grants and to exclude Norbert Wiener, who was a academic rival he didn't want to invite to his summer camp. So he didn't want to use the term cybernetics, because then you'd have to invite Norbert and be his disciple instead of being the father of AI, right? And academics will really understand that impulse. So it is a marketing term, and it was interesting when the AI hype kind of started. The AlexNet paper was 2012, and that was what I referred to as this sort of catalytic moment where the ingredients came together for this AI hype boom. And there was sort of, at the beginning in Google and other, the tech industry writ large, they were sort of toying with what are we going to call the rehydration, the revival of these old techniques, right? Are we going to call them, IBM was like, we're calling it machine intelligence, and tried to make that happen and then everyone dropped it because no one was paying attention to IBM. And then Google was like, we're going with machine learning because we're the scientific ones, we're the smart ones. And no one really wanted to market machine learning. And I think around 2015, 2016, it was the industry, not the field, the marketing departments of the industry kind of set on the term AI, which has been dominant since. But it was, these are marketing departments make these decisions. I've seen it, right? They sit with the product manager and the eng director, and they're like, how should we call this? So it is a marketing term. It doesn't mean it's worthless. It doesn't mean the techniques aren't useful for some things. But right now, what they're describing are these, systems that only a handful of companies can create and use nose to tail, that rely on vast amounts of data. We're not even talking about labor. We haven't talked about IP and the kind of, just unethical extraction of the creative labor of billions of people. It costs a huge amount of money, incredibly environmentally costly processes that rely on computational systems that are genuinely hitting kind of thresholds around energy use and water use that people are now conjuring solving fusion to solve, right? Really environmentally costly, and that even once they're trained, so you have a model, you can sort of then take the model, it's been trained, you don't have to train it again, and training is very expensive. Using it and deploying it is incredibly costly. So inference, which is the process of using AI, costs way, way more than traditional information retrieval or search. So what we're talking about here is technologies of the haves, right? The people with this kind of capital can actually develop it. And with this kind of capital and resources, we're talking about 5, 7 corporations, right? These are the hyperscalers. They're the ones with the compute, with the data, with the ability to draw talent, with the platforms to continually suck in the data, and to use it only a handful have market access. So it's either you're licensing AI models you developed through cloud systems, so Microsoft Azure, Amazon AWS, Google Cloud, or you're using it as some sort of product or feature in your platform. So this is why you can't open WhatsApp without like some silly AI, like, please, like Mark said, we had an OKR for AI, so we had to put this bot in here. So those are the two kind of vectors to market. And then if we're talking about the cloud licensing, it's basically Fortune 500 companies and governments who are being enticed to sign big cloud contracts to license like a GPT AI and white label that or use that in customer support or what have you. So again, this is not a technology that we use as a rule. We might spin up ChatGPT or one of the other kind of consumer-facing artifacts. It's generally a technology whose use is being determined by an incredibly concentrated set of actors who are generally those who have power over us, put colloquially. So like bosses, police, governments, not a people's technology.
We have seen a massive race to, put stakes in the ground and own different parts of this spectrum of possibility. And you have just outlined how you have to be, partnered with people with incredible wealth and resources already to be able to play in that pool. We are also facing lots of elections at the moment, and there are lots of consumer-facing tools now, some of which you would say have been rushed to market and don't seem to be fully tested. Google Overview, I'm looking at you. And I wonder, what are you hearing and how are you thinking about the way AI consumer-facing tools have the potential to subvert democracies with the way you can create media of them so rapidly?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking a lot about this. I have not seen a huge amount of evidence of deep fakes or, like that has emerged, right? And we are, we're tempting fate with a lot of this stuff. We definitely see kind of the collapse of the web ongoing as just like garbage content, and the kind of retraining on garbage content accelerates. But I actually want to point to another use of AI that isn't as readily apparent to consumers, and that's one of the big reasons around 2012 at the beginning of the 2010s that these companies like perked up was because they recognized that these AI, like convolutional neural nets, the AI technique of the moment, were really good at optimizing for ad targeting and algorithmic engagement. So like that's what AI is. Like that's the market. That's where the money is. And so it was, it's no accident that the authors of this paper I keep referring to were all immediately hired to Google. The guy who was sort of the architect of these late 1980s convolutional neural nets with backpropagation technique, Yann LeCun, immediately hired to Meta, right? The reason Google and Meta had a lead in AI for a very long time was because they were implementing it as a mechanism of algorithmic tuning and ad serving. And I don't think it's an accident that the algorithmic changes to YouTube that came out of Google Brain, which was their AI group, were linked pretty clearly to some of the radicalization and some of the like feeding of incendiary, racist, misogynist content that was a documented problem in the lead up to the 2016 elections. So, when we talk about AI in elections, I don't think we can get away from the fact that we have, there are 5 dominant social media platforms in the world. People might see the recording of this talk online, but they're almost certainly going to encounter that recording not through a Wheeler Center website. They're going to go to X or I don't know, wherever it's posted, and they're going to see it there, right? And it will be subject to these algorithmic whims. And like, that's what I'm worried about, right? Like we have 5 for our jurisdiction in the US. It's not unlikely we will have a Trump presidency. There's a very explicit plan called the 2025 Project, which is sort of, kind of documenting it's basically the transition plan were Trump to become president. It makes very clear one of the moves that they are hoping to execute, were that to happen, is to move the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission under direct executive control. So anyway, yeah, that was also my heart skipping a beat when I said it. But I do think, like that's more than deep fakes, right? Like we don't walk on the ground and find a deep fake laying around. We encounter it on these mass homogenized information ecosystems that, again, are largely jurisdictioned in the US.
We live in a world where a lot of people can't recognize a deepfake when they see it, and then moving on from that.
Or I don't know if I can.
That's right.
How would I know?
That's right. And similarly, we live in a world where a lot of people think their devices are always listening to them because the serving up of ad content is spooky and a little bit too good. Except it's also terrible and shows you things that you already know of. Given all of this data, are you surprised that things aren't served up to you even more specifically, or are there things that we can do to subvert as individuals? The sort of data that we're putting out there. Yes, we could use secure messaging services, but what sorts of consumer level capabilities do people have to mess with the system in a way?
Well, I mean, I don't have a one weird trick here. Like, definitely use Signal. Definitely be sort of a bit picky and mindful about all of this. Like, for real, don't put that thing in an email. Don't send that picture if you don't love him. Like, for real, just because that's hygiene, but that's not subverting concentrated power at this scale, right? But that's still just good to do as human beings. And if you do send that picture, it's fine. You're still lovely. Everyone's okay. But I think, what can we do to subvert it? Like, I guess I want to almost perturb that question a little bit. So we're talking about, like, how can we prevent them from getting our data? Like, I don't think data, or I will assert, data is not an organic substance. It's not an off gas, like a pheromone we just produce, and they come around behind us and sweep it up, and then they're all like, we have the original Meredith data right here, right? It's like, in some sense, it's a fiction, right? It's it's a proxy for things that they care about. It's answering questions that they're interested in having the answers to. It really doesn't have much to do with me. Poets and philosophers have wanted to understand human desire for ages, right? It's, in a sense, it's you can never crack consciousness, right? You never truly know what Meredith's thinking, but like maybe Meredith's cell tower ping and the number of coffees she bought today and that like amount of text she's sending to the WhatsApp group she finally joined, like all of that can be cobbled together and matched against a bunch of assumptions some guys in Mountain View have, and will make a Meredith profile, right? So like, I think the issue is, I'm getting around to this. The issue isn't necessarily like preventing them from getting our data. It's undermining the fact that we've effectively ceded authority to them to define us in the first place. Like, I don't care if you have data. I'm going to say that data doesn't matter because I get to define myself, because we get to define ourselves, because the way we know and the way we relate is ours, not yours. And so I think there is a sort of undermining of epistemic authority that has to happen at the core of this question, not a sort of calibration of data flows or ingress or egress, and like, you can know that about me, but not this. I think we need to delegitimize this way of knowing.
I'm sure that's a big comfort to the Strava users and health app addicts and what have you in the room, who've become, a little bit addicted to having our own personal metrics in various apps and things. It is a very, seductive sort of space. Oh, yes. It's
so nice to feel like a world that can be so scary and wild is in our control. Like, that's the Huberman thing, right? Like, we can all, like, if we just follow the protocol, the rest can also be tamed.
Definitely. It's 7:05. I do want to call out that we will open for questions in a little while.
We could have been like 8:05 and I would not have known.
I know. I know. You're doing very well. You've had a very busy schedule. I can't have you up here without bringing up the fact that in 2018, it was reported that you led a mass staff walkout at Google over both the company's lax handling of sexual harassment allegations, but also the moral and ethical implications of its business practices more broadly. I wonder if you'd like to talk about that a little bit. It's been quite a time since that's passed, and how you think worker activism has been progressing since then.
Yeah. Well, I'm often framed as like the leader, And that's not true. I just want to,
That's why I put you a reporter, because I never trust these things.
A headline, you got to click, and that's what, But of course, there was, 20,000 people walked out. I was one of the people who did the labor of helping organize and coordinate that, but there were many, many people beside me, and it is literally collective action happens no other way but collectively. I think, I am not, there's now a union established at Google. There is now sort of a robust conversation discussing the necessity of whistleblowing in tech, particularly given the socially significant determinations these companies are making and the opacity that corporate secrecy allows them to make those determinations in the name of profit, not social good. So I think all of that is positive, and at the same time, we've seen a drastic and reactionary turn in the tech industry, where we're having kind of a neo-fascist current become dominant. The veil is getting thinner and thinner, and I think there has been a resurgence or not a resurgence, I think a kind of manufactured growth of defense tech, which actually relates to the cost of the AI economy and the fact that they're not finding a fit for market for many of these extremely expensive technologies. And of course, military contracts are a great way to bury ineffective tech and get a huge amount of money for it and never be held accountable. Sorry, there's a lot in there. So I think, I wouldn't go back and do it any other way, but I'm really, when I look at sort of the legacy there, a big thing that we were protesting was Google's contracts with the Department of Defense to build drone surveillance and targeting systems for the US drone war, which is where the signature strike was developed. And for those of you not familiar with what the signature strike is appalling. It is targeting people for death based not on knowing who they are or what they did or anything about them, their name, anything, but based instead on the fact that data, their surveillance data, the data profile, matches a profile that you have deemed to look like a terrorist or a bad person. And I saw what they were doing, and I knew the US drone war has been deemed illegal by every international humanitarian organization, and it was, for me, a deeply politicizing period of time growing up post 9/11 and sort of coming to consciousness. So I was glad we were able to stop that contract and sort of marshal our expertise and our courage there. But I look now at what's happening in Gaza, and we know via investigative reporting by 972 and The Guardian that systems using this same logic of the signature strike, but supercharging them with AI, are being used to create kill lists. And when they didn't produce enough targets, they lowered the confidence interval. And anyone who knows what statistics is knows what that means. So I think that sadly we did not smash the paradigm, but we were right. And I think anyone who cares about the ethical implications of AI, who is concerned about this topic, needs to be looking at how it's being deployed in Gaza and the unimaginably inhumane consequences of offloading those kind of decisions to probability instead of human judgment.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you a prospectively lighter question before we open up to questions from the audience, just to get you in the right frame of mind. You've mentioned in the past that Ursula Franklin's The Real World of Technology helped shape your conception of the future. And I wondered, what lessons might you have learnt from that apply to our current landscape? What still, compels you about that piece of work?
Oh God! I mean, I have had like 3 copies of that book, and I've listened to the lectures on. You can go to Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has an archive of the Massey lectures, and you can listen to the whole thing there, if you want a nice Saturday. But Ursula Franklin was a theoretical physicist. She was a Quaker peace activist and a Holocaust survivor who was a professor in Canada. She's an incredible human being. And I found this book accidentally because I was reading Doris Lessing's Prisons We Choose to Live Inside, and there was on the back like a list of other Massey lectures, because they were like, Doris Lessing gave this Massey lecture, and then I was like, oh, I'll check some more out, and I found it. And I remember, I was in tech kind of training, I was in tech, but I came out of the rhetoric and English literature program at Berkeley. So I was just in a realm that was very unfamiliar to me for a number of reasons. And I remember I was reading all the time, trying to understand what I'm doing. What is this industry? This is mid-2000s. So, there was the Kool-Aid was the water, and we swam in it. It was very, I was just trying to figure out what was going on. And it was hitting that book, I think it was on a flight in 2009, maybe? I don't know, young. And I felt like I had just found my person almost. I was like, oh my God, someone is talking about tech, from the late 1980s, but nonetheless, there was so much prescience here. But she's talking about it in a way that feels like it's sort of yoking my more critical, more humanistic training to the environment I'm in every single day, to the quotidian decisions I'm making as a worker at Google. And I don't have a one less. I'm really bad at stack ranking. But I think, she defines technology very early on as the way we do things around here. And I think that, that kind of helped me, I don't know, it helped me in viewing, what are we what are the normative habits? What is the socio-technical apparatus that I'm encountering at Google that is sort of shaping this thing? This is not it denaturalized, I think, a lot of the rhetoric that I was sort of taught to take as a given as an entry-level worker at Google, kind of, learning all of it from the ground up in an environment where there was a self-satisfied knowledge in that culture that we had figured out how to become the first ethical billionaires. And we got it, and everyone should be learning from us. You're a healthcare practitioner, we're solving healthcare, right? And that, that sounds like that was how it was. You'd just be in meetings, and that was it was oh, well, we're Google, we'll solve that. You have a problem, we'll solve that, right? And, the kind of, we can laugh at that now. No one was laughing. Everyone believed it. And then I'd go home on the shuttle at night and get home at 9 p.m. because I commuted to Berkeley and be like, what is this? And so I feel like she was a touchstone. That's it's a kind of boring long story, but please just read Ursula Franklin. It was really, I think she still has so much to say many years later.
Well, thank you for that. This being the Wheeler Centre, we do like to give people things to add to their reading list, so that's spectacular. Thank you. We are going to open up for questions now, and I want to give people opportunities. We have some ushers who are around, and they're going to select people, not me, so you can look as pleadingly as you like, but I'm not making the decisions.
I can't even see, so I'm very grateful to everyone who's helping.
We'll just have to create a picture. Thank you.
I have a question that's less about the choices we can make right now, but the choices we can set ourselves up to demand in the future. So I'm wondering and thinking about your comment on the idea that we might have data profiles everywhere. There's bits and pieces, like twins of ourselves in different data centres around the world. What is the future system, architecture, social, political pressure that could allow us to have a sovereign version of our data profiles that we hold on to and kind of break, I guess, the commercial inspiration behind the surveillance capitalism that we see?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's really lovely. I'm not going to have the whole answer. I think this is a very deep question, and ultimately that question is, how do we know ourselves in our world? What practices should we be engaging in to collect information that we feel capably provides a reliable proxy for a complex world? What are we comfortable knowing about ourselves? So again, it's sort of delegitimizing this idea that data is even in itself a synonym for a fact or a truth, and rethinking, okay, what would it mean to create methods of collecting our knowledge and our world that we feel are reliable, and then how do we make sure that that reliable information or data is used in ways that are aligned with our aspirations and expectations. So I would point, there's two different paradigms that come to mind. Francesca Bria, who is a great, Francesca Bria is someone who worked with the city of Barcelona to set up a data commons for the city. So this was sort of, how do we govern, how do we create data that is sort of the property of the city and that is used for civic efforts, right? We want to understand how our infrastructure is running. We want to understand, many things about running the city. How do we do that without sort of outsourcing that, epistemic process to a corporation or losing power over that data? So I would look at the Barcelona model as one sort of, again, this is a kind of prefigurative example of what could be. I would also look at, there's some work being done, and I don't have it on the top of mind, but around indigenous data sovereignty coming out of Maori people in New Zealand. And this is really thinking about how do we, in an age of extractive AI, how do knowledges and practices and, art, remain in the sovereign hands of the community that values it, that understands it, that knows it, and then how does that interact with a more technocratic world, or does it at all? And I think, those paradigms for me give me hints of what a future where we treated knowledge differently than data, and we respected it as a communally governed artifact that we were a participant in shaping and deciding on.
Thank you. We'll try another.
Thank you for being here, Meredith. Firstly, my name's Jamie. I am a data practitioner, and I find myself wondering in my work and also in my local community, what are some things that, from your perspective, I can do or we can do as individuals in the industry, I guess under that AI umbrella, to, I guess, address that socio-technical problem and that business model and those kind of 5 or however many big tech companies that just have so much control. Can you think of any tangible ways that we can do this on a smaller scale, on a local scale, while dealing with stakeholders and carrying out our everyday work? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jamie. That's really good. I won't have a one-size-fits-all answer, and I feel like I'm frustrating this way. But I think being in your position, being an expert in your domain, in sort of whatever computational systems you grapple with and work with, means that you have already, I think, a perspective and a set of skills that are hugely valuable. And I think one of the things we're suffering now is that for a number of years, at least through the entirety of my career in tech, the conversation around tech regulation, tech futures, has been marked by a politics of intellectual shame, where if people don't have computational training, if they don't have a CS degree, if they don't program or otherwise have some expertise that relates to building or maintaining computational systems, they are considered unworthy of having a voice in the conversation. And that is still true. This is why we have memes of senators, how dumb they are, they should not be governing technology, even though we don't question an engineer, in a conference room in Mountain View stepping up to say, we'll solve medicine without a medical degree, right? So I think it's, sadly this persists, and I think one thing that's so important is the people who do have that firsthand understanding of these systems stepping up to say, like, no, this is how they work, and these are their limits. They are not magic god demons. They're compute, an infrastructure, and sometimes the buffer overflows and the whole thing craps out, and some guy who carries a pager has to get out of bed at 3 a.m. and open up a command line and figure out what's happening, right? Like, that's the real. And I think rematerializing these systems and narrating their limits is really important, coming from people who do have that expertise and can't be discredited given the culture we're in. And then for the rest of it, I think, I do this frequently, but I'll invoke a International Workers of the World slogan, which I love, which is dig where you stand. And that implies there's no one-size-fits-all recipe for every human being for change, is really look around. Who is around you? Who is your community? What are your risks? Are you on a visa? That might mean you have risks that you can't take, that others need to take. When we were organizing at Google, there were a lot of people who supported us who could not take those risks because they didn't have the same privileges. So we were always evening those things out, saying like, who can be in front? That was one of the reasons I was in front. I didn't have kids. I didn't have a visa. I was, fairly safe financially. And so, I could be one of those people, which is why I insist on not being called the leader, right? Because that wasn't, what we were doing is balancing risk. And so I think just thinking about, where do you stand? What do you witness? What do you have to give? And who's around you who can be in solidarity with you and bolster your efforts is, the answer will come from that, in my view. Thank you.
Hi, Meredith. Thank you. You've already answered the question about data governance and data sovereignty. I would like to ask you to weigh in on open source software, both as an enabler of these companies' practices and these governments' atrocities in some cases, and also the so-called foundational open source models. How can they be deployed to the population to do things that we want to do instead of things that we don't want done to us? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a really huge question, sir. That is just quite a question. So I don't like open source, I know almost too much about open source. And I'm sure when I say that, there's a mailing list full of 100 guys who will say that, no, you don't. It's GPL. Anyway, I don't have in an extractive economy, the commons will be extracted. And so, the cleave of open source from free software in the late 80s, the Eric Raymond of it all of that, the kind of turn to the market without a sort of recognition of these extractive dynamics, let alone the labor politics of open source, leaves us in a space where this is a sort of, it's a high concept term that doesn't always, carry forth the values that it promised, right? I worked at Google on the Core Infrastructure Initiative for a while. I helped found that, which is trying to resource the core libraries on which the entirety of the commercial internet depend, and that are often maintained by like one guy on a boat who's been maintaining it for years, and if he stopped, the entire thing would collapse. But no one really wants to pay him because everyone's getting it for free, so why would you be the one to pay him, right? Like that's the paradigm we're talking about here. I don't have a quick solution for that other than, there are things like the Sovereign Tech Fund out of Germany, the Open Tech Foundation in the US that are trying to fund these things. But again, we're talking about petty cash compared to the capital that tech has, often like $100,000 or, whatever. Anyway, on open source AI, I think I actually have a paper in final review in Nature on this topic. It's in preprint on SSRN now, so you can read it. And this, it's called, sorry, it's been a second. Open for Business, Big Tech Concentrated Power and the Political Economy of Open AI. And this really asks the question, one, what is open source AI? Because when I first encountered that term, I didn't understand how an incredibly pedantic licensing framework around software was then being projected onto these sort of massive systems that include expensive compute, huge amounts of labor, all of this. Like, how is that called open? So we sort of diagram the resources required to develop AI and then kind of go through what can actually be open about these or not, and conclude that, while there are more or less open models that allow extensibility, transparency, and reuse, what we don't have is any analog to open source software, nor, of course, do we have something that is anywhere near capable of democratizing or sort of spreading the wealth of AI, which is how the open source, the marketing of open source AI via Meta and others has been used in the regulatory debates to basically say there's no, or there's not as many issues with concentrated power, or we should embrace these because they're open, and by the transitive property, open means they're somehow more democratic, less concentrated, et cetera, which, as we show, is not true.
You've had a very busy schedule, Meredith. Do you want to take one or two more questions?
Oh, I can keep going.
All
yeah.
right. We'll,
However
let's go.
many you think.
Let's try and exhaust you.
Hi, can you
No,
hear me?
this gives me energy.
I
That's
love
how
it.
I do
love
it.
No, I mean exhaust the questions out of the pool.
Oh, yeah. Let's exhaust you.
Yes.
Hi, Meredith. I just want to say thank you. I think there are a huge number of us here who are huge fans of yours, and it's just really exciting to see you speak in real life. I don't know if you can see me down the back. I've also had a fabulous 2 weeks. I had the opportunity to talk with Emily Bender on a podcast last week, and now I'm getting to talk to you.
Yeah.
The question, she's also another Dead Set legend who I think inspires a lot of us. So my question is, circling back to your comment about the drone program, I've been astonished at the lack of outrage over what's happening in terms of the targeting now. And as an international lawyer who has an understanding of systems and has worked in AI impact assessments for the last many years, and with Microsoft now having offices at the UN, what's the best way to engage from your perspective? Is it through the tech? Is it through the law? Is it at a time when the companies that you've just talked about are basically driving what is acceptable and what's not? From where you sit, what's the best way to join that conversation, have an impact? I'd love your views on that. Thank you very much.
Just to make sure I'm getting the question, on the use of AI in Gaza or more generally?
AI in Gaza, which will inevitably be used in other places going
Yeah.
forward, as we're at a very tense time in history.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll be real. I'm always real, I guess. I think one of the issues is the neo-McCarthy environment for speech around Palestine. Like people, a lot of the people who drive the work on ethics and AI are academics, or they're in very comfortable professional jobs, and they don't want to take the risk of speaking up because we are seeing people being fired or blacklisted or otherwise made uncomfortable. And frankly, a lot of folks in those professions didn't get into that business to be uncomfortable. So yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and it's, I gave a talk on this, and every time I would mention it, I could feel my adrenaline rise. Like, I can feel it. I can feel the discomfort. I can feel the, it's scary. I just don't, like, that can act in my body, but I'm not acting on it now. I'm just going to talk about it. So I think it's hard to bring up for that reason. And there's also, there's been a huge amount of money poured into the defense tech industry. You have Founders Fund, you have Andreessen Horowitz, you have these big players behind a lot of this tech that are also incredibly good at media, incredibly good at narrative. Like, if you look at like Andreessen Horowitz from Mark Andreessen back at Netscape, like, he was like, what, he's very smart, sadly, happily, whatever, but he was a genius at narrative. Like, that's what they were doing back then. They would inflate the narrative, get the valuation, sort of, and that, you see that continuing to happen. So I think, we just have to do it, right? Like, if you don't speak out while it's happening, you don't speak out, right? Like, I don't, like, there's either you do it or you don't do it. And I also think, I'll mention one thing that I think is a good model here. AI Now Institute, which I co-founded, but I no longer lead. It's under the leadership of Amba Kok and Sarah Myers-West, and it's never been stronger. They're brilliant. They just hired someone named Heidi Kloff, who is also exceptionally brilliant, and she for a long time did safety and assurance testing for nuclear plants. And so what she's going to be doing is effectively bringing those skills and those techniques, which most AI safety is kind of wafty. It doesn't draw on actual sort of, the rigor of safety engineering. And she's bringing rigorous safety engineering to begin to apply that to some of these systems, right? So I think there is a way, like, that technique involves, effectively taking them at their word, saying, okay, you claim that these systems can do X, Y, and Z, but we're looking at their safety properties, we're looking at the libraries we use, we're looking at the fact it's written in Python and that's not a memory-safe language, all of this, and we're calling BS on the marketing because the marketing was written for generals and starry-eyed guys in the Pentagon. It was not written for technologists and people who actually get what this does. So I think we can call them on their bluff, on their terms. And then I think, it's, in a sense, I don't have a better answer than to, like, to me, that's digging where we stand. Like, for me, I'm like, okay, I have a platform, I have to talk about it, and I have I have a background in, looking at these drone efforts. I spoke out at Google, and now I'm seeing that continuation. So for me, this is a lane I cannot abandon. And I think, we're going to be 3 years from now, there are a lot of people going to be pretending they spoke up because it will look worse and worse. So that's an invitation, I guess. But it's not one weird trick. It's a very, we're in a pernicious time.
I'm going to potentially, so too many people aren't disappointed, say we'll take 2 more and then we'll reassess.
Oh, hi. Thanks for what you're saying. It's totally clear and inspiring. It's fantastic. It's a different perspective. We don't hear much. Look, I'm going to try and get a whole lot of ideas into a neat little question. Bouncing off profiling for drones and being a profitable product for them to, release all this technology into the military market. Here's the situation in Australia. Australia is a similar problem, but a different situation. Australia is the most profitable drug market in the world, for instance, because we're rich and we're really isolated from supply. So cocaine in Australia is the most expensive in the world. Now, often you hear the law enforcement people saying, look, we're getting 25% of the import. Busts millions of tons, but it's only 25%. And that figure has stayed flat for years. Now, the question is, all right, 75% are getting away. Now, here's the worryful thing. They've got a philosophy when you're not succeeding in busting people, they've got to think, all right, we're never going to get the evidence. We're never going to bust all these other 75%. But we've got a working philosophy. It's called disrupt and degrade. Disrupt and degrade. So all the people that we find fit the profile that they could be involved in the other 75% of the drug trade, we will disrupt and degrade their lives and their liberty hard. We'll really go for it. Now, I'm just wondering if you know that there might be an AI, high-tech AI market for law enforcement in the drug game, which might profile these people that are being disrupted and degraded their liberty and all sorts of things. Similar to the profiling for drones.
I mean, I think, I don't know the Australian landscape, but what I would say is I would be shocked and incredulous if there weren't. If they didn't have some technique, however rudimentary, that was scraping social media posts, credit data, whatever else, using that to create profiles that were then compared against some vendor's system that was sold to, the police chiefs at some point that promised to magically detect who has an essential soul of a drug dealer and who doesn't, right? I'm based in New York. I come from Los Angeles. Those are two epicenters of police tech who have massive police budgets. So we've been seeing in New York, a lot of the scraping tools that are used on Facebook and social media. These, Palantir has a big contract in New York. So I would just be very, very surprised if they didn't have tech like that. And again, they have that tech this year. And then what is the vendor going to sell them next year? What add-on feature? What sort of, increasing the bloat of that surveillance? What is that going to look like? So, yeah.
Who here has the perfect last question for Meredith this evening? Yes, so we go with the enthusiasm.
Oh, well, that worked. Look, you've given me an absolutely terrifying view of the future. But I'm trying to understand something a little bit more about the past and maybe hopefully we can learn something from that. Can you explain when exactly and why did Google abandon the do no harm motto they had? And what can we learn from that?
Oh, well, I think they abandoned it like 2017, but just sort of dropped it from, I don't actually remember, like, I remember they abandoned it, but it became news like a couple years after they abandoned it because someone went through some official Google site that none of the employees read and realized it had been dropped, and then the general counsel made some weasel word statement about it being like, you know, more inclusive or like clearer to say like, we will try as hard as we can. But like, ultimately, I think the lawyers got to it. Because, you know, as vacuous as a slogan is in the context of, you know, that environment, it was a touchstone. Like, you would be in a room with a bunch of engineers. People took that seriously, and they would say, like, do you think this is evil? Right? Like, it had a force. And I know when we found out about the drone contract and we were organizing around it, that was a touchstone in a lot of those rooms, where it was like, you know, people would seriously sit there with themselves and consider, do we think this is evil or not? So I think, you know, I think the lawyers got to it, but I don't actually remember the story. It was some sort of procedural thing where it got blown up on like The Verge or Gawker, and then we realized it had happened a while ago, but they just hadn't announced it. They sort of hoped it would get, you know, memory holds. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was great. Meredith, thanks so much for joining us tonight. You have called your particular brand of optimism, and you are an optimist, an invitation to analysis and action, not a ticket to complacency. I hope we can all take a bit from that as we go our ways tonight. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience and for your thoughtful questions. My thanks to the Wheeler Centre in partnership with Igniting Change, particularly Jane Tewson here, and Head of Programming Veronica Sullivan, our Senior Program and Podcast Producer Lauren Taylor, all of the fabulous staff at the Wheeler Centre for looking after us this evening. Do stay up to date with future events and join the mailing list at wheelercentre.com. But before you do that, please join me in thanking our guest this evening, Meredith Whittaker. Thank you so much.